Imagine it's January 1999. MTV is the most powerful force in music. If your video plays on that channel, the world stops and listens. 50 million households, one screen, one moment. And then a strange, bleach-blonde white kid with a chainsaw appears. Hi, my name is what? My name is who? My name is Slim Shady. The phones at MTV lit up instantly, not with complaints, with people asking, who is that? Radio stations across America started getting the same calls before the sun came up the next morning. DJs were rewinding. Executives were scrambling. A 19-year-old in Detroit heard it on the radio and called her friend just to hold the phone up to the speaker. The world had just met Slim Shady, and nothing in hip-hop, nothing in popular music would ever be quite the same. But here's what nobody was talking about that night. 3 years before that video aired, 3 years before the Grammy nominations, before the sold-out arenas, before the name Eminem became synonymous with the word genius, Marshall Mathers was scrubbing grease off commercial dishes in a Detroit restaurant kitchen for $5.50 an hour. He had just failed 9th grade for the 3rd time. He had a daughter he was desperate to provide for, a mother he could barely talk to, and a dream that everyone around him, absolutely everyone, had told him was ridiculous. Think about that paradox for a moment. The man who would one day be called a rap god, the man who would break Guinness World Records, sell over 100 million albums, and rewrite what it meant to be a white artist in black music, was at its lowest, a dishwasher who couldn't get through high school. This is the Eminem story, and it's not the story you think you know. To understand Marshall Mathers, you first have to understand Detroit. Not the Detroit of postcards, not the Detroit of Motown glory and automobile dreams. The Detroit that Marshall grew up in was a city already well into its long, painful unraveling. The factories were closing. The neighborhoods were hollowing out. Block by block, one boarded window at a time, an American city was swallowing itself whole. This is where Marshall Bruce Mathers III was born on October 17, 1972. His father left before Marshall was old enough to form a memory of him. Letters sent to his father as a boy came back unopened. That's not a metaphor. That is a fact that Marshall has spoken about publicly. Letters returned, no explanation, no goodbye. Just silence where a father should have been. His mother, Debbie, was young, unstable, and fighting battles Marshall couldn't fully understand as a child. The family moved, and moved again, and then again. By the time Marshall was 18 years old, he had lived at more than 30 different addresses. 30. Think about what that does to a child's sense of safety, of belonging, of permanence. You don't make friends when you move that much. You don't build roots. You learn to read rooms fast and to find your footing quickly, and when things get hard, you learn to disappear inside your own head. Here's something most people never consider about Marshall's childhood. He wasn't just poor. He wasn't just unstable. He was a white kid living primarily in black neighborhoods in Detroit. In hip-hop culture, a culture he loved with every cell in his body, he was automatically, immediately an outsider. Too white for the culture he loved. Too broken and too poor to fit into mainstream white America either. Marshall Mathers existed in a gap between two worlds, and neither one wanted to claim him. Detroit doesn't coddle its dreamers, it tests them. It puts weight on their shoulders early and watches to see who buckles. Most buckle. Most people reading this right now, if placed in Marshall's exact circumstances, would have buckled. The statistics on children from his background, the poverty, the absent parent, the constant relocation, the maternal instability, those statistics are not kind. But Marshall found something. He found language. Specifically, he found rap. He found that words strung together in a certain rhythm at a certain speed with a certain internal logic could do things that nothing else in his world could do. They could wound. They could heal. They could take the chaos inside his head and give it structure. His uncle Ronnie, only a few years older than Marshall, introduced him to hip-hop. LL Cool J, the Beastie Boys, Run DMC. Marshall absorbed every record he could get his hands on. He memorized lyrics the way other kids memorize sports statistics. He studied cadence and delivery like it was a science. Because for him, it was survival. By his mid-teens, Marshall wasn't just listening to rap. He was living inside it. He started attending open mics and rap battles across Detroit. The underground scene there was fierce, raw, and completely unforgiving. These weren't polished performances. These were verbal street fights where your credibility, and sometimes your physical safety, depended on how well you could destroy someone with a microphone. And every single time Marshall Mathers stepped into one of those circles, he got tested for the same reason. He was white. The mockery was immediate and sometimes brutal. Some crowds wouldn't even let him finish. Why would a black art form, one born out of generations of pain, resistance, and cultural identity that white America had consistently tried to suppress, why would it open its arms to a white kid from a broken home who showed up with a notebook full of rhymes? The answer, as it turned out, was it wouldn't. Not easily, not without a fight. But here is what those crowds underestimated. Marshall Mathers had been an outsider his entire life. He had been told he didn't belong since before he was old enough to spell the word. Rejection was not new to him. Rejection was Tuesday. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He got better. He wrote constantly. He studied the construction of verses the way an architecture student studies blueprints. He worked on speed, on internal rhyme schemes, on the ability to flip any insult thrown at him back at his opponent before the crowd even finished laughing. He developed a skill that is genuinely rare in any art form, the ability to weaponize vulnerability, to take the worst, most embarrassing, most painful things about his life and turn them into ammunition. Consider this. Almost every major battle rapper in Detroit at the time has gone on record saying that Marshall, even as a teenager, was technically one of the best they had ever heard. Not the most famous, not the most celebrated, but technically, syllable for syllable, line for line, they knew. His reputation built slowly, then all at once. By the mid-1990s, the name Eminem, a wordplay on his initials M and M, Marshall Mathers, was known in Detroit hip-hop circles. He released independent material, he collaborated, he hustled. All while working restaurant jobs to keep the lights on for himself, and soon, for his daughter Haley Jade, born in 1995. Fatherhood didn't slow him down. If anything, it sharpened his desperation into something closer to purpose. Then came 1997, and a trip to Los Angeles that would change everything through failure. The Rap Olympics was one of the most prestigious freestyle battle competitions in the country. Marshall went to Los Angeles, competed against some of the best battle rappers in America, and placed second. Second. Not first, second. He didn't win. And that loss is the single luckiest moment of his entire career. Because someone at that competition had a demo tape that Marshall had been circulating, a tape that somehow, through the kind of chain reaction you cannot engineer and cannot predict, ended up in the hands of a man named Andre Romel Young. You probably know him as Dr. Dre. The battle he lost changed everything. Dr. Dre, co-founder of NWA, architect of West Coast gangsta rap, the man behind Snoop Dogg's debut, and one of the most respected and feared voices in the entire music industry, listened to that tape in his car. And he drove around the block and listened again. By Dre's own account, he didn't fully process at first that the voice he was hearing belonged to a white kid from Detroit. He just knew that the voice was extraordinary. The technical precision, the dark humor, the internal rhyme density that forced you to rewind and listen again just to catch everything he'd packed into a single bar. Dre has said publicly, and this is a direct paraphrase of his words, that he immediately got on the phone and told his team, "Find this kid now." Marshall got the call, and if you want to understand what that call meant, understand that Dr. Dre calling you in 1998 was not just a record deal. It was a legitimization. It was the most credible figure in black music, the genre's ultimate gatekeeper, saying, "This person belongs here." The backlash was immediate, and it was loud. A white rapper, signed by Dre. The think pieces wrote themselves. Critics lined up to declare it either a brilliant marketing stunt or a cultural betrayal. The questions were real and they were fair. Was Eminem authentic, or was he a novelty? Was Dre discovering a generational talent or commodifying a culture for crossover appeal? Marshall felt every word of that criticism. He has said so. Privately, he wrestled with the question of whether he deserved to be there, not because he doubted his skill, but because he understood the history. He knew what hip-hop had come from. He knew what it meant. And that awareness, that genuine, almost tortured respect for the culture, is part of what made what came next so remarkable. In the studio with Dre, Marshall began building something he had been constructing in his mind for years. A character, an alter ego, a psychological mask that would let him say the things that Marshall Mathers, anxious, guarded, deeply wounded Marshall, couldn't say in his own voice. He called the character Slim Shady. Most people think Slim Shady was just a rap name. It wasn't. It was a survival mechanism. It was Marshall Mathers creating a fictional version of himself who had no fear, no filter, no shame, who could take every dark thought, every violent impulse, every absurd observation about American culture and the music industry, and detonate it on wax without apology. Slim Shady could say what Marshall felt, and Marshall could watch from a safe distance. The Slim Shady LP dropped in February 1999. In 7 days, it sold 1.8 million copies in the United States alone. It received 4 Grammy nominations. It won 2. The Eminem biography from that point forward would never again include the words unknown or struggling, at least not professionally. The world that had ignored Marshall Mathers, mocked him, returned his letters, moved him 30 times, and failed him out of 9th grade 3 times. That world was now paying to hear what he had to say. The irony would not have been lost on him. But fame, it turns out, is not rescue. Fame is a magnifying glass. It takes everything inside you, the beauty and the brutality, the love and the damage, and it makes it bigger, more visible, more dangerous. And Marshall Mathers had a great deal of damage left to detonate. The backlash that came for Eminem after the Slim Shady LP was not small. It was coordinated, sustained, and in certain respects, completely understandable. LGBTQ+ advocacy groups objected loudly and specifically to the language in his lyrics. Parent organizations called for boycotts. Politicians named him in speeches as a symbol of cultural decay. The controversy was real, and it was loud, and it followed him from interview to interview like a shadow he couldn't shake. And here is the complicated truth about that period, the one that gets lost when people reduce it to either cancel culture before cancel culture, or censorship of a genius. Marshall was not entirely wrong to say what he said, and he was not entirely right either. He performed at the Grammys in 2001 alongside Elton John, a gesture of solidarity and context that stunned both his critics and his supporters. Elton John, one of the most celebrated gay artists in music history, standing beside Slim Shady, 2 men from completely different worlds finding something real in each other's art. The image was more complicated than any think piece could handle, which is exactly what Marshall wanted. But the controversy he felt most deeply had nothing to do with media cycles or protest movements. It had to do with Kim Scott, his on-again, off-again partner, the mother of his daughter Haley Jade, represented the most turbulent, most human, most genuinely painful chapter of his personal life during this period. Their relationship was volatile in ways that both of them have acknowledged. The custody battle for Haley was bitter and very public and left marks that neither of them has fully described, even decades later. There's a version of the Eminem life story that focuses entirely on the spectacle, the controversies, the feuds, and the provocations. But step back for one moment and look at what was actually happening beneath all of that noise. Here was a man who had never had a stable home, who had never had a reliable parent, who was now, at the height of global fame, fighting desperately to be the father he never had, to keep his daughter in his life, to not repeat the cycle that had shaped him. Haley Jade was the one constant in his universe. In interviews across decades, through every controversy and collapse and comeback, the one subject that consistently broke through Marshall's armor was his daughter. The way he talked about her, the way the hardness in his voice softened, the way the smartest, most calculating man in hip-hop became, in those moments, simply a father who loved his kid. The Marshall Mathers LP arrived in 2000 and sold nearly 2 million copies in its first week, breaking the previous record for fastest-selling rap album. The Eminem Show followed in 2002. The film 8 Mile arrived later that same year, and with it came something unexpected: critical respect. Eminem's 8 Mile was not just a movie, it was a declaration. It put Marshall's origin story on a global screen and dared the world to watch a white kid from a broken home earn his place through nothing but skill. The film's signature song, Lose Yourself, won the Academy Award for Best Original Song, the first hip-hop track in history to do so. The man who failed ninth grade 3 times just won an Oscar. But the music could only hold so much weight, and the weight was getting heavier. In 2005, Marshall Mathers did not release an album. In 2006, he did not release an album. In 2007, very nearly, he did not survive. The prescription pill addiction crept in the way these things always do, not all at once, not with a single dramatic moment of weakness, but slowly, over years, through the cumulative weight of chronic pain and chronic fame, and the particular, relentless exhaustion of being simultaneously the most celebrated and most attacked artist in American music. He has spoken about this period with more honesty than most public figures ever manage about their lowest points. The sleeping pills. The dependence built itself so gradually, he didn't recognize it as dependence until he was in it completely. The creative silence, which, for a man who had used music as his primary coping mechanism since childhood, was not just a professional absence but a psychological crisis. The near overdose in late 2007, the moment his body came close to simply stopping, was, by his own account, the genuine bottom. Here is what the tabloids never understood about this chapter of the Eminem story. They covered it as a fall from grace, as a celebrity cautionary tale. But what it actually was, if you listen to what Marshall has said about it, if you read between the lines of the music that came after, was the moment he was forced to stop running, to stop using Slim Shady as an escape hatch, to sit with Marshall Mathers, the damaged, brilliant, terrified man underneath the persona, and decide whether that man was worth saving. He decided yes. The road back was not cinematic. It was not a single inspirational speech or a sudden creative breakthrough. It was rehab and therapy and the slow, grinding work of rebuilding a relationship between a man and his own mind. It took years. And then in 2010, Recovery. The album was raw in a way that nothing in his catalog had been quite so nakedly. Not provocatively raw, not Slim Shady raw, but genuinely, plainly, heartbreakingly honest. He was no longer performing damage. He was reporting it directly in clear language to anyone willing to listen. Recovery became the best-selling album of 2010, worldwide, across every genre. He didn't just survive his demons. He made them into music and sold 100 million copies. That sentence deserves to sit for a moment. The addiction that nearly took his life became the creative fuel for the most commercially successful album of his career. The silence that felt like death became the space he needed to find something true. The almost end became, somehow, a beginning. Not every comeback story works this way. Most don't. But occasionally, someone falls all the way to the bottom and finds out that the bottom is not the end, it's the foundation. Marshall Mathers built his second act on a foundation of honest rubble. And the second act, it turned out, had some of his finest work still ahead. October 2013. A music video is released online with no warning, no promotional campaign, and no elaborate rollout. Just Marshall Mathers, a track called Rap God, and 6 minutes of what many linguists, music critics, and fellow artists would subsequently describe as the most technically demanding solo rap performance ever committed to a commercial recording. At one point in the song, he delivers, and measure this carefully, 97 words in approximately 15 seconds. The Guinness World Records Committee reviewed it. They agreed. The track entered the record books for the most words in a hit single. The Detroit rapper who couldn't pass 9th grade had just achieved a formally certified world record in the use of the English language. There is something almost cosmically right about that. By 2013, the music industry had changed almost beyond recognition from the landscape Marshall had entered in 1999. Streaming was replacing physical sales. A new generation of artists, Kendrick Lamar, Drake, and J. Cole, was redefining what hip-hop could be and sound like. Every era creates pressure on its predecessors to either evolve or be replaced. Eminem refused to be replaced, not by staying static, that never works, but by doing something far more difficult. He kept growing. The reunion with Dr. Dre on the Compton album in 2015 felt less like nostalgia and more like confirmation. Two men who had found each other through a lost battle and a circulated tape, still, nearly 2 decades later, still creating, still pushing, and still relevant. Dre had built one of the most successful business empires in the history of American entertainment. Marshall had built one of the most enduring artistic catalogs in the history of recorded music. And together, they remained something rare in an industry that devours its own with alarming speed. Essential. In his personal life, the years after recovery brought something Marshall had spent his entire life trying to find and never quite holding onto for long: stability. Haley Jade, the daughter he had battled through courts and chaos and collapsed years to remain present for, graduated from high school with honors. Then college. She built a life, a public one eventually on social media, where she appears by all evidence as a grounded, thoughtful, entirely normal young woman. The son of a man who received returned letters and abandoned addresses, raised a daughter who could write about her father with warmth. That is the most underrated achievement in the entire Eminem biography. His sobriety held, his focus shifted from survival to legacy, and the work, the relentless, obsessive, technically staggering work, continued. Pull back now. All the way back. Because we've been telling you the Eminem documentary, the specific facts and specific cities and specific moments. But underneath all of that is something much larger. Something that belongs to you, whoever you are, wherever you're watching this from. This is a story about a child who was handed almost nothing. No stability, no father, no security, no obvious path, and who refused to treat that as a verdict. Think about the systems that should have filtered Marshall Mathers out. The school failed him 3 times in the same grade. The music industry had a template for what a rapper looked like, sounded like, and came from, and Marshall matched exactly none of it. The cultural gatekeepers who decided, before he opened his mouth, that his presence was either a joke or a threat. Think about how many people accepted those verdicts and walked away. Marshall didn't walk away, he wrote faster, he rhymed harder, he went back to the battle the next night and the night after that. He put his daughter's face in his mind and he kept going. Every person who was told they didn't belong somewhere, that they weren't the right background, the right look, the right color, the right fit, or the right anything. Eminem is your evidence that the system can be beaten. Not easily, not without cost, not without years of grinding in rooms where nobody believed in you, and the rejection felt less like motivation and more like gravity. But beaten. Detroit hip-hop gave the world something it didn't know it needed. A voice that sounded like everything wrong with America. The poverty, the dysfunction, the rage, the dark humor of people who have learned to laugh at their own pain, because the alternative is too heavy to carry, and turned it into art that people on every continent listened to on their worst days and felt slightly less alone. That is what great art does. It finds the most specific, most honest, most personal truth it can, and somehow in that specific honesty, it touches something universal. Marshall Mathers found his truth in a Detroit kitchen at 5.50 an hour. He found it in rap battles where crowds laughed before he finished his first line. He found it at the bottom of a prescription bottle, in the silence of a studio he couldn't bring himself to enter. And he made it into music that will outlast all of us. If this story moved you, if you saw something of your own struggle in Marshall's, or if you simply fell in love with the audacity of a man who refused every ceiling the world handed him, let us know in the comments below. Tell us which chapter hit hardest for you. We read every single one. And if you're new to the Fame Breakthrough channel, we tell stories like this one every week. Stories about the people who made it not because the world was kind to them, but because they refused to let it be the last word. Subscribe, stay with us, because there are more stories like this one, stories that remind you exactly what's possible when someone refuses to quit.